I have spent a good part of this year reading auction catalogues, not the modern kind, the old ones, printed for houses that came down long ago, bound in cloth, sold to people who wanted to be seen holding one. They are strange things to read. A catalogue does not describe a home. It describes a home taken apart and laid out in numbered pieces, each one measured, each one waiting for a hand to go up. The candlesticks get a number. So does the table they stood on. Sometimes the room does too. This documentary is about 5 of those sales. They ran from the 1880s to the 1960s, and between them they emptied some of the largest private houses ever built in America. A merchant prince on Fifth Avenue, the woman who ruled New York society, one newspaper owner who had bought a monastery and could not keep it, then a banker's widow at 79, and a coal fortune in Newport that outlasted the age which made it. Different families, different decades, one thing held in common. Each of them found out what a life is worth once it has been broken into lots and offered to strangers. The answer was almost never the one they expected. There is an easy version of this story, and it is worth setting aside before we start. In the easy version, these people are punished for their wealth, and the auction is the bill arriving. The record does not support that. What the catalogs actually show is colder and more interesting than punishment. Objects have prices. Houses have prices. The moment a family stops wanting a thing, the market decides what it is worth. And the market has no memory whatsoever of what it cost to buy. That gap between what these things cost and what they brought is the whole subject. We begin in a concert hall on Fifth Avenue on an evening in March, in a room full of people who had come to spend money. By the end of that week, they had stopped bidding altogether. Chapter 1. The room where nobody bid. The sale began at 7:30 in the evening. Chickering Hall stood at the corner of 5th Avenue and 18th Street, and on the 23rd of March, 1887, it was doing duty as a sale room. The audience had come for the pictures. Everyone knew what was coming, because everyone had read the book. That catalog ran to nearly 250 pages. 500 copies were printed and numbered, gilt-edged and bound in red. One description from the period remarked on its awkward size and on the fact that its cost discouraged anyone from throwing it out. Holding a copy marked you as a person entitled to be in the room. Inside were the contents of a house at 1 West 34th Street, finished in 1869 and faced entirely in marble. 55 rooms. Frescoed ceilings by an Italian painter who had also worked on an imperial palace in Brazil. The man who built it had come from County Antrim with almost nothing, and opened a dry goods store facing City Hall Park. By the time Alexander Turney Stewart died in 1876, estimates of his estate ran somewhere between $35 and $60 million. He left all of it to his wife. Cornelia Stewart died 10 years later. Her executors ordered the sale, and one of them was a former judge named Henry Hilton, who had served the family as attorney for years. So the room that filled up on that March evening was not settling the merchant's estate. It was settling his widow's. On the north wall of the Stewart Picture Gallery there had hung a canvas by the French painter Meissonier, a battlefield scene bought directly from the artist 11 years earlier. Most of the audience had come to watch that one lot. It sold for $66,000. The buyer was Henry Hilton. An artist for one of the illustrated weeklies was in the hall and drew the moment the hammer came down. The engraving ran the following week, captioned with the figure. For a few days, that number was the loudest thing in American art. What I notice in that engraving is never the auctioneer but the rows behind him, every face turned the same way. Then the sale moved uptown, and the trouble started. Pictures had gone first, at Chickering Hall, across 3 evenings. What remained went to the American art galleries and was offered over the following week. Furniture, bronzes, and the marble. Stewart had collected sculpture with the same appetite he brought to everything else. Among the pieces was a version of a work by Hiram Powers, one of the best-known American sculptors of the century. Nobody wanted it. Reports from the closing session agree on what happened. The bidders went quiet. Figures that had been expected did not arrive, the prices asked were not met, and one statue after another failed to sell. The Powers went unsold. A detail here sits awkwardly against the catalogue itself. Its title page announced that the collection would be sold without reserve, which is a promise that everything goes at whatever the room offers. Reporting from the final session describes reserve prices the sculpture could not reach. Both accounts survive in the record. The outcome is not in dispute. Henry Hilton bought the statues himself. An executor buying in goods he was appointed to sell is not, on its own, unusual. It is what a seller does when a room has decided a thing is worth less than he can accept. But it meant the marble never left. Back it went to the house it had come from, into the rooms where it had always stood, for another 3 years. America's first great house sale had ended by proving something nobody in that building came to learn. A collection is worth what the last person present will pay for it, and no rule anywhere says a person has to bid. The house on 34th Street came down in 1901. That painting had a longer life. Hilton kept it until his death and left it to the Metropolitan Museum, where it hangs today, a few miles north of the corner where it was sold. Anyone standing in front of it is looking at the one object in this documentary that went for more than expected. Everything else you are about to see went for less. Chapter 2. The Firm That Outlived Them. All. The auction business does not require you to own anything. That is the whole advantage of it. A dealer buys stock, carries the risk and hopes. An auction house takes possession of nothing, guarantees nothing, and collects a percentage of whatever a room decides on a given afternoon. The goods belong to somebody else right up until the moment they belong to somebody else again. 3 men set that arrangement up in New York in 1883. Their names were James Sutton and Austin Robertson, and the third was Thomas Kirby. Sutton and Robertson had tried it once already. They opened a gallery in 1879 and shut it 3 years later. The third partner ran the rostrum, and he had been working sale rooms since the early 1870s, first for other firms and later under his own name. They took premises on East 23rd Street and called the venture the American Art Association. The name was a small piece of misdirection. It sounded like a society for the encouragement of painters. In its first season it behaved like one, mounting exhibitions of American work as a benefit for the National Academy of Design. What the business actually was, and what it became almost at once, was a machine for turning private property into cash. The machine found its purpose in 1885. A businessman named George Seeney had failed. His collection came to the new firm, the sale that followed was managed well, and a reputation was made. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The event which established the most important auction house in America was not a triumph. It was somebody's collapse. A second collection came the following year from the estate of a woman named Mary Morgan. In the spring after that, the merchant's widow on 34th Street. 3 sales, 3 years, and every one of them was an ending. A failure, then a death, then another death. This was not cynicism on Kirby's part. It was simply what the supply looked like. Great collections do not arrive at market while the owner is solvent and well and content in the house. They arrive when something has stopped. Kirby stood at the rostrum for 4 decades. He was still working when the firm moved uptown to East 57th Street in 1922. Contemporaries by then described him as the senior man of the American sale room. His son Gustavus had joined the business in 1912 and became half-owner 3 years afterwards. Then, in 1923, Thomas Kirby retired and sold the American Art Association to a collector named Cortlandt Field Bishop. Kirby died the year after, although at least one account puts it a year earlier, and the record has never entirely settled. Bishop hired 2 men to run the sale rooms for him. One was Hiram Parke. The other was Parke Bernet. Hold those names. In 1929, the association merged with the Anderson Auction Company. 9 years later, the combined firm took the names of the 2 men Bishop had brought in, and Parke Bernet Galleries came into being. That change of signage matters for everything still ahead. When a Philadelphia banker's widow sold her husband's collection in 1944, Parke Bernet ran it. When the last fully staffed household in Newport was emptied in 1962, Parke Bernet ran that as well. 4 of the 5 sales in this documentary went through one continuous business, under 3 different names, across 75 years. I cannot find anywhere in the surviving papers a point at which the firm treats any of it as a loss. Those papers do survive. Close to 28 linear feet of them sit in the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art, and something near 1,000 photographs are held at the Frick. Sales statements, ledgers, estate inventories and appraisal documents, client account books listing who bought what and for how much and on which day. The families are gone. Their houses are mostly gone. The paperwork is catalogued, climate-controlled, and available to any researcher who books an appointment. Chapter 3. They sold the ceilings. The catalog for the sale at 840 Fifth Avenue sets out what was on offer. Paintings of the 19th century French school, furniture, tapestries and objects of art, bronzes and ironwork. And then, in the same breath, carved wood wall paneling, painted insets and ceilings. Nobody was selling the things inside that house. The house itself was for sale in pieces, working outward from the rooms. To understand how that was possible, you need to know what the building had been. Construction ran on the northeast corner of 65th Street from 1894 to 1896. Richard Morris Hunt designed it in the manner of a French chateau of the early 16th century. It was not one residence, but 2, joined behind a single facade. Caroline Astor took the northern half and her son took the southern. The 2 halves shared a ballroom. That room is the reason any of this is remembered. It held 1,200 people. Her previous address, the one which gave American society its most famous number, had a ballroom for 400. She had tripled the room and kept the standard. A portrait of her hung inside it. According to a newspaper account written years afterwards, she used to stand beneath that portrait and receive her guests as they arrived. Then the arithmetic of inheritance did what it always does. Caroline Astor died in the autumn of 1908. Her son John Jacob Astor IV took the whole building and brought in architects to make one house out of 2. He unveiled the result in 1910 and had 2 years to enjoy it, before going down with the Titanic in April of 1912. His widow Madeline held the property until she remarried in 1916. At that point it passed to her stepson Vincent. Vincent Astor did not want it. There is no mystery in his reasoning and no drama in it either. He preferred the country places. Upkeep ran to a fortune, and Fifth Avenue in the 1920s was turning commercial at speed. He put the property on the market in the middle of the decade and the land sold, which left the contents, and the American Art Association came in to deal with those. The sale was held inside the house, not at a gallery and not in a hall, but in the rooms where the objects had always sat. Buyers walked the floors the guests had walked and looked at things exactly where they stood. For 2 days in April of 1926, the public was let in. Anyone could come. America's most exclusive interior was open to whoever wanted a look. That same room had decided who mattered in New York for a generation, now had a catalog circulating through it and a number on every surface. They sold the bronzes and the pictures. The furniture went, along with the carpets and the hangings. Her silver and her china were listed as lots and taken, and then the walls went too. It took me a long time to accept what the catalog actually means by that. Paneling can be unscrewed. Painted insets lift out. A carved ceiling comes down in sections and goes back up somewhere else entirely. A wealthy buyer in 1926 could purchase a room from that house and install it in his own. Some did exactly that. Whole interiors left the building boxed and numbered, to be rebuilt in places their makers had never imagined. Where they finished up is a story for later, and it is stranger than you would guess. What stayed behind was a shell. Demolition followed. On the corner where the double chateau had stood, Temple Emmanuel went up, and it is standing there now. One quality separates this sale from every other one here. The auction on 34th Street dispersed a collection. This one dispersed a building. Those surfaces, everything a guest would have studied while waiting to be received, were itemized and carried off by strangers over a single weekend in spring. The ballroom that held 1,200 people held nothing at all by the Monday. Chapter 4. The Store on the Fifth Floor. In 1937, the largest private buyer of art in the world stopped buying. William Randolph Hearst had been spending better than $1 million a year on objects. One trade estimate put him at roughly a quarter of the entire international market in what dealers called odds and ends, meaning everything that was not a major painting: furniture, armor, silver, stained glass, whole fittings lifted out of European churches. Then it ended. Not because his taste had changed, but because the money was gone. He owned a great deal of machinery by that point. 28 newspapers, a film studio, a wire service, radio stations, 13 magazines. Almost none of it was generating what it cost, and the estate in California ate money in a way that has to be seen in a ledger to be believed. The animals went to zoos. Staff were let go. Newspapers were sold to cover the upkeep on a house. That left the collection, and the collection was the problem. An advisor put the difficulty plainly. Selling it through the normal auction rooms, lot by lot across years of scheduled sales, would take longer than Hearst had. The comparison he reached for involved emptying an oil tanker with an eyedropper. So Hearst did something no American of his standing had done before. He took it to a department store. Gimbel Brothers occupied a building beside Pennsylvania Station, and by the 1930s it was the largest department store corporation on Earth, measured by sales. Working with Saks Fifth Avenue and under the direction of Hammer Galleries, whose principal was the dealer Armand Hammer, Gimbels cleared its fifth floor. Onto that floor went the collection of the most acquisitive private buyer in the world. Nobody bid on anything. No rostrum stood at the end of the floor, no auctioneer worked a lectern, and no catalogue was read aloud. Instead, there were price tags. A shopper could ride the lift past hosiery and kitchenware and walk out onto the fifth floor. There, she could buy a piece of a European castle the way she might buy a lamp. The advertising did not pretend otherwise. It offered art at clearance prices, which is exactly what it was. 2 catalogues were printed. One covered the objects, the other was given over entirely to architectural elements, which tells you how much of Hearst's buying had been building material rather than decoration. If I read the surviving records correctly, the strangest thing about this sale is not its scale but its ordinariness. The transactions look like retail because they were retail. Somebody came in, looked at a thing, decided what it was worth to them, and paid at a counter. The dates are less tidy than the story wants them to be. Some accounts put the Hearst selling at Gimbels beginning in 1939. The catalogues carry 1941. Individual transactions are documented across that whole span, so it is safest to think of it as a period rather than an event, running perhaps 3 years. What it was not at any point was dignified. Stewart had a printed volume and an audience in evening dress. Astor had the house itself as a setting and a public queue at the door. This one had a sales floor, a service lift, and a cash register in a store whose main claim to fame was a rivalry with Macy's. That is the part worth holding on to. Hearst had spent 30 years assembling the largest private collection in the country. And when it came apart, it did not come apart in a sale room. It came apart in a shop. Chapter 5. The Ledger. Why does a thing sell for less than it cost? Not sometimes, almost always, and by margins that look absurd written down. This is the mechanical heart of every sale in this documentary, and it is worth stopping to look at directly, because the answer is not that these families were cheated. 3 forces operate and they all point the same way. The first is time. A collection assembled over 40 years is disposed of in 4 days. Every purchase in that collection had an unlimited horizon behind it. The owner waited for the right object, negotiated at leisure, and walked away when the price was wrong. None of that is available to an executor with a court date. The second is the buying pool. When a man wants a Flemish altarpiece, he competes against everyone in the world who also wants one. When his estate sells it, the buyers are whoever turns up that afternoon in that city, with cash available. The third is the spread, and this is the one people miss. Almost everything in these houses had been bought at retail. A dealer found the object, carried it, insured it, waited sometimes for years, and sold it at a price that covered all of that plus a profit. The buyer paid the top of the market by definition, because a dealer's price is the top of the market. When the same object goes back out, it goes out at wholesale. The dealer buying it at the sale has to make his margin all over again on the next customer. So the object crosses the same spread twice in opposite directions, and the family absorbs both crossings. There is a transaction in the Hearst records that shows the whole mechanism in miniature. In 1913, he bought a dagger through a London dealer. Copper blade, 2 ridges running down the center, handle set with ebony and alabaster. He paid $40.88 for it, which was a real price for a real antiquity. On the 31st of March, 1941, he sold that dagger to Gimbel brothers. He got $19, 28 years of ownership, and the object came back out at less than half what went in. That is before any account is taken of what $40 in 1913 would have earned in a bank. The figure that stays with me is not the loss, it is the precision. Somebody wrote down 88 cents in 1913. Somebody else wrote down $19 in 1941. Both entries survive, which means the arithmetic here is not an estimate. The dagger is in the collection of a university art museum in New Jersey now. It has been there since the year it was sold. Scale that spread across a warehouse, or a house, or a Spanish monastery, and you have the entire subject. None of this is immoral. Markets do not punish anybody. A market simply reports, on a given Tuesday, what the people present are willing to hand over. That report has no connection to what was paid or hoped for, or what the object meant to its owner. A catalog records desire. Prices realized record circumstance. Everything difficult about these 5 sales lives in the gap between those 2 documents. Chapter 6. The Widow at 79. Eva Stotesbury was 79 years old when her husband's collection came up for sale. She had married him in 1912, when he was already one of the wealthiest men in America. Edward Stotesbury was a senior partner at Drexel & Company in Philadelphia and an associate of Pierpont Morgan. His wedding present to her was a pearl necklace reported at close to $500,000. Then she built a house. White Marsh Hall went up outside Philadelphia across 5 years from 1916, designed by Horace Trumbauer on 400 acres, 147 rooms, 100,000 square feet of floor spread across 6 stories, 3 of them below ground. 70 gardeners kept the grounds. 40 more staff worked inside. It cost somewhere around $10 million to build and roughly $1 million a year to keep running. Henry Ford visited once and said afterwards that it had been an education in how the rich live. Edward Stotesbury died in 1938. What that man left behind is the part of this story that people find hardest to believe. By 1919, his income was running at $5.5 million a year, and his estate was estimated then at around $100 million. By his death, it had reportedly come down to about $4 million. The figures come from a single secondary account and should be treated with that in mind, but the direction is not in doubt, and neither is what followed. His widow began selling. Art went first, then the antiques, then the real estate. She sold jewelry he had given her, including the pendant from the wedding. By most accounts, she got very little back for any of it. Some pieces she did not sell. She gave several works to the Philadelphia Museum of Art in her husband's name because he had helped establish it, and she wanted that remembered. It is worth noting that a woman selling her jewelry to stay afloat still found things she would not put on the market. That house emptied by degrees. She closed it and moved to Florida, then to Washington. During the war, she leased the building to the Metropolitan Museum, which used it as a stronghold for its own collection while New York was thought to be at risk. She also gave away the fence. 2 miles of steel, 8 feet high, went to the War Department to be melted down. On a Saturday in November of that year, Parke Bernet in New York offered the contents of his collection. The catalog listed paintings and furniture alongside objects of art belonging to the late Edward T. Stotesbury. Lot 1 was a portrait by Rayburn. I keep returning to the ordering of that sale. Lot 1 is the first thing a room sees, the piece chosen to lead with. A Rayburn portrait of a Scottish lady in a red cloak is not a minor object. It went out the door first, and everything else followed it. Eva Stotesbury returned to Washington and lived in a rented house. She died 2 years later. Her house outlasted her by rather longer, though not in any form she would have recognized. A chemical company bought it and turned it into laboratories. There is a newspaper description of the conversion from the autumn of 1944, and it is the most quietly brutal document in the whole of this documentary. It goes through the guest bedrooms by name. There was a chintz room, a portico room, and a lacquer room. Others were known as the Apricot, the Blue, the Adam, the Queen Anne. Each of those rooms had once had its own stationery, printed to match the decoration. A guest writing a letter wrote it on paper that agreed with the walls. By 1944, every one of them held a double work table with a soapstone top and a trough for the disposal of chemical waste. Whitemarsh Hall came down in 1980. A housing development stands on the site. Chapter 7. 14,000 crates. 14,000 wooden crates, each weighing around 500 pounds, once sat in a warehouse in the Bronx. Inside them was a monastery. The Cistercian house at Sacraminia in the province of Segovia was founded in the 12th century under Alfonso VII of Castile. Spain seized it in the 1830s and sold it off, after which it spent a century as agricultural buildings. When an agent working for Hearst found it, a farmer was keeping livestock in the cloister and storing manure in the chapter house. Hearst bought it anyway and had it taken apart. That phrase does a lot of quiet work, so it is worth unpacking. Every stone was numbered. Each one was wrapped in hay and packed into a crate built for it. The cloister came out, and the chapter house and the refectory and the whole assembly was shipped across the Atlantic to be rebuilt in California. It never was rebuilt. The crates went into storage and stayed there. By the time the collection was being liquidated, the monastery had a price on it. Hearst had paid something in the region of $500,000 to acquire and move it. A buyer at Gimbels was offered the entire thing for around $50,000, plus the cost of carting it away. Nobody took it at that price. This chapter is about the objects that did not fit the machinery of the sale, and there were more of them than you might expect. An auction room can handle a painting. It can handle a chair, a clock, a set of plate. What defeats it is a thing that must be dismantled before delivery, or a thing worth less than the cost of moving it. For those, a different market operates. Not a sale room at all, but a scrapyard. Consider what happened at Harbor Hill. Clarence Mackay had inherited a silver fortune and built a house above Roslyn on Long Island, designed by Stanford White on a site over 600 acres. He filled it with arms and armor bought across 3 decades. Death came in 1938, and what remained of his collections was sold by the family. His widow lost the Manhattan townhouse to the bank in 1940. The estate fences went for scrap during the war. 50 acres of the grounds were leased to the Army. The house stood empty and vandals worked it over. Before it was dynamited in 1947, 100 tons of cast iron was stripped out of the building and sold by weight. Read that again. The final commercial transaction in the history of one of the largest houses ever built on Long Island was conducted by the ton. I went looking for the price that iron brought and could not find it recorded anywhere, which is itself the point. Nobody catalogued it. Nobody printed 500 numbered copies and had them bound in red. Scrap does not get a catalog because scrap is not sold to collectors. The same logic had already taken the railings around Whitemarsh Hall, valued not as ironwork but as raw material for the war. Down on Fifth Avenue, the pattern was starker still. Developers paid $7 million for the ground under the largest private house in New York, and the building standing on it counted for nothing in that figure. It was an obstacle. The land was the asset. A house that costs a fortune to build and a fortune to run is worth whatever the site is worth once you have removed it. So the objects went to sale rooms, and the architecture went to the wreckers, and the metal went to the furnaces. 3 markets, running at once, moving in different directions. Only one of them printed a catalog. Chapter 8. 684. Lots. Julia Berwind kept 40 servants. She kept them into the 1960s in a house on Bellevue Avenue in Newport. Her social season ran 6 weeks, exactly as it had run when she was young. Nobody else in America was still living that way. The staff, the season, the whole apparatus of a Gilded Age household had gone everywhere else, and it had not gone here. Her brother built the place. Edward Berwind made his money in coal, and by the time he died, he was reckoned among the most powerful men in the country. Horace Trumbauer designed it for him after an 18th century French chateau. The work finished at the turn of the century, at a cost of roughly $1.5 million. Berwind's wife died in 1922, and he asked his sister to act as hostess. He died himself in 1936. Julia stayed and kept everything exactly as it was for another 25 years. She died in May of 1961 in her mid-90s. There were no children. The house went to her nephew, Charles Dunlop, who understood immediately that he could not run it and had no wish to try. He looked for someone else in the family to take it and found nobody. So he sold to a syndicate of developers from New York who intended to clear the site. Then Parke Bernet came to Newport. Their catalog runs to 151 pages and lists 684 lots. Furniture and works of art in the elms, it says on the cover. The Newport residence of the late Miss Julia A. Berwind. The dates on it are the 27th and 28th of June, 1962. 2 days to take apart a household that had been kept intact for 60 years. A writer covering it for a New York paper described an ivory gavel sounding indoors on a bright afternoon. The sale, he noted, was settling an estate whose legal and financial and social business all ran at once. Newport understood what was happening. 6 of the great cottages had already gone for shopping centers or been handed to schools. Villa Rosa came down that same year. Whichever way this one went, people said the rest of Bellevue Avenue would follow. The first day realized $201,382. Prices ran well above what anyone had predicted. A New York dealer paid $40,000 for a 16th century Flemish Madonna and Child. 4 Venetian bronzes went for $8,000. Hold that first day figure, because here is what happened next. The stock market turned down in the spring of 1962, and the developers who had bought the house found their position weaker than it had been. That gave an opening. The Preservation Society of Newport County raised money at speed and bought the property weeks before demolition was due to start. They paid $116,000. I would like to be able to say the numbers there are close. They are not. One day of selling furniture out of the building brought in nearly twice what the entire property cost, including the house, the grounds, and the guest cottages. The contents were worth more than the container. Not marginally, by a factor approaching 2. That is the whole argument of this documentary, arriving at the end of it, in a single afternoon's receipts on Bellevue Avenue in the summer of 1962. The Elms opened to the public that same year. It was the first Gilded Age house the Preservation Society ever rescued, and the rescue happened by accident because a stock market wobbled at the right moment. Everything worth looking at inside it had already left in a lorry. Chapter 9, where it stands now. 15 miles north of downtown Miami there is a church. It belongs to an Episcopal diocese. Services run on Sunday mornings and at midday on Wednesdays, and weddings book the place up, so visitors are told to telephone before making the drive out. The cloister is 12th century Spanish. It is the same cloister a farmer near Segovia had been keeping cattle in. Those crates sat in storage for around 30 years. Nobody could work out what to do with them. Then, in 1953, A group of Miami developers bought the dismantled monastery and put it back together. None of them was a collector. They were buying a tourist attraction, and that is more or less what it became. This is the part nobody plans for. Objects assembled over decades to say something about one family end up somewhere with no connection to that family at all, doing a completely different job. Usually a public one. Take the painting from the very first sale. The Meissonier that made $66,000 at Chickering Hall stayed with its buyer for the rest of his life. On his death, it passed by bequest to the Metropolitan. It hangs there now. Nothing survives of the marble house it came out of. That was pulled down at the start of the new century. But the picture off the north wall of that gallery is on public view, about 3 miles from the corner where it sold. The paneled rooms went south. While the Astor sale was running that April, the Ringling family were finishing a house of their own in Sarasota. They bought rooms out of the catalog and had them shipped to Florida. Those interiors are in the Ringling Museum today. Surfaces that once enclosed New York society at its most exclusive now sit on the Gulf Coast, in a building open to anybody who pays the admission. The dagger went to New Jersey. Gimbels took it off Hearst in 1941 for $19. Princeton University acquired it that same year, and it has stayed there ever since. A clearance counter object in the spring. A museum piece by the autumn. Other things from that sale scattered much further. The Metropolitan picked up items Hearst had originally bought for under $30. That dispersal was thorough enough to defeat the record-keeping entirely. A researcher tracing an Aztec textile fragment through the archive eventually located a missing yoke by matching it against old photographs. The fragment itself has never been found. I had assumed, before working on this, that a dispersal like these amounted to a straightforward loss. Nothing in the record bears that out. Almost every important object here now sits somewhere the public can walk in and look at it, usually without paying, usually under better lighting than the house ever gave it. The Elms is the clearest case of all. Furniture that went out of that building in June of 1962 has been coming back ever since. 4 canvases were recovered in 2004. 2 more were secured in 2012 after they failed to sell at auction in London for $650,000. That last figure is worth a moment. Newport bought the entire property for the sum quoted earlier, with grounds and outbuildings thrown in. Half a century later, the same organization paid $650,000 for 2 pictures that used to hang on its walls. The building cost less than 2 of the paintings that came out of it. Chapter 10. What the Catalogues Prove. Almost nothing in this documentary would be knowable without the catalogues. That is not a small point, and it is worth ending on. It explains why 5 commercial events from a century or more ago can be reconstructed to the day and the dollar, when much else about these families cannot. Consider the nature of a sale catalog. No memoir is involved here. Nobody is trying to make anybody look good. This was a working document, produced by a firm that needed buyers to turn up and bid. Objects appear in the order they would be offered, described well enough for a dealer in another city to decide whether to travel. Because it had to be accurate to be useful, it is accurate. And because these firms kept their paperwork, we have the other half as well. Sales statements survive. So do the ledgers and the client account books naming purchasers and the sums they handed over. Put the two together and you have something historians almost never get. A complete inventory of a household valued twice. Once by the family in what they paid, then again by the market in what they got. The volumes themselves became objects, which is its own small irony. 500 numbered copies of a red gilt-edged folio, printed for a sale in 1887, now sit in rare book rooms and turn up in dealers' listings. A book made to sell a house has now outlived that house by 120 years. The archives hold the rest. Nearly 28 linear feet at the Smithsonian. 1,000 photographs at the Frick. The Metropolitan's library holds the volume. From the Astor sale, digitized. Anybody with a connection can turn its pages and read the inventory of that ballroom before it emptied. I do not think these documents show what people assume they show. The popular version of the Gilded Age ending is a moral one. Excess is punished, fortunes are humbled, and the auctions are where the reckoning lands. Every catalog in this project cuts against that. What they record is something with no moral content at all. A family buys, over decades, at the dearest end of the market because they compete with everyone else chasing the same thing. Then, circumstances change. Somebody dies, or a business fails, or an heir simply does not want a house of that size, and the same objects go back out at whatever the room will bear on a particular Tuesday. What sits between those two numbers is not a judgment. It is a measurement. What it measures is the distance between wanting a thing and needing to be rid of it. That distance has held roughly steady in every century that kept records. What changed across the 75 years covered here was only the setting. There was a concert room on Fifth Avenue, then a drawing room with numbers stuck to its walls. Later, a department store beside a railway station, a gallery uptown, and finally a lawn in Newport with a gavel sounding across it. The mechanism underneath never changed at all, neither did the paperwork. 4 of the 5 houses in this documentary are gone. Stewart's Marble Palace off Fifth Avenue went first. The Astor Chateau followed in the 1920s, and a synagogue stands on that corner. Whitemarsh Hall lasted until 1980, before a housing development covered the ground. Harbor Hill was dynamited. Only the coal baron's place on Bellevue Avenue survived, and it survived by luck. A market slipped at the right moment, and a preservation society moved faster than a demolition contractor. That is a poor record for buildings that were meant to last forever. The objects did better. Most are on public display in Manhattan and Sarasota and New Jersey and North Miami Beach. Institutions look after them now with proper climate control and far better lighting than private hands ever gave them. You could call that a happy ending. It is more accurate to call it a transfer. Everything in this story moved in one direction. Private became public. A family became an institution. A house that a few hundred people would ever enter became a building anybody can walk into on a Tuesday afternoon. The auctions were the mechanism of that transfer, not the tragedy, the mechanism. And the families understood what they were doing. Vince and Astor knew what would happen to the paneling. Eva Stotesbury knew her jewelry would go for a fraction. Nobody was deceived. They were selling, and selling means accepting the market's figure rather than your own. There is one thing in all of this I have not been able to shake. At every one of these sales, in the crowd, there were people who had come simply to look. In 1887, they held catalogues too heavy to carry comfortably. Nearly 40 years on, they queued outside a house they would never have been invited into. And at the last of these sales, they stood on a lawn watching a gavel come down on a Flemish painting. Not one of them was buying. They were seeing the inside of a world which had spent 75 years keeping them out. The sales did that, not the reformers, not the tax code, not any act of Congress. 5 commercial transactions, run for profit by a firm that changed its name twice, opened those doors and let the contents out. The catalogs are still there if you want to read them. Most are free.